Mystical tariffs or sanctions by tyranny? The Brazilian media and the communist elephant in the democracy room. Ah, Brazil, land of samba, sunshine, and media sophistry, where reality is more twisted than a pretzel at a street fair. I'm Enrique Toledo, and welcome to Decoder Talks, the show that doesn't buy ready-made narratives or swallow frogs dressed up as Prince Charming. If you're here, you've probably had enough of hearing the parrots of big media repeat the mantra of trade tariffs as if they were some kind of climate whim, an economic cloud hovering over the Atlantic deciding when to rain down steel and aluminum. But, oh innocent listener, if you think the problem is just a market squabble between Uncle Sam and Uncle Lula, sit down and grab a strong coffee, because what I'm going to decode today is the biggest illusion trick since Houdini escaped from a straitjacket. The U.S. tariffs aren't about trade. They're covert sanctions for democratic violations, arbitrary trials, political prisoners rotting in cells, and censorship that makes the Spanish Inquisition look like a debate club. And worst of all, the mainstream media, this troop of UOL, Globo, CNN, and the like, covers for the government like it's a year-end cleaning, hiding the communist elephant in the room while shouting, "Look at the little bird of sovereignty." The basics, unraveling the narrative of tariffs as a trade dispute. Let's start with the basics to get even that viewer up to speed, the one who, by some cosmic accident, tuned in here after 2 minutes of broadcast TV and still believes the 8 o'clock news is unbiased. Picture the scene. You turn on the TV and there's William Bonner, anchor in a flawless suit, talking about tariff reciprocity, WTO disputes, and Yankee protectionism, as if Trump, who returned to the White House in 2025, just woke up one day and decided to punish Brazil because he didn't like our beans. Oh, let's slap high tariffs on Brazilian steel and aluminum because, well, just because. No, my friends, that's just a load of nonsense meant to fool the gullible. The media feeds you this mush because it's part of the system itself. It's propaganda disguised as journalism, funded by government advertising money and aligned with an agenda that turns the country into a red banana republic. They talk about national sovereignty as if it were a magic shield against the world, but sovereignty, arrogance, and especially communism don't put food on the table. They just empty store shelves, pile up debt, and send the rich abroad while ordinary people are left to foot the bill. In reality, the tariffs imposed by the U.S. in 2025 go beyond just steel and aluminum. President Trump announced an increase to 50% in tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from all countries, including Brazil, effective from June 2025, doubling the previous rate of 25%. But the focus on Brazil escalated to a threat of 50% tariffs on all Brazilian imports starting in August, explicitly tied to non-economic issues. This isn't random protectionism, it's a calculated response to deep-rooted problems. The elephant in the room, sanctions for authoritarian abuses. The elephant in the room, which Globo ignores as if it were invisible, is that these tariffs are a direct retaliation for the authoritarian abuses of the Brazilian regime. Voices like Paulo Figueiredo and Eduardo Bolsonaro, who refuse to stay silent in the face of censorship, have been raising this issue for months. The U.S. is sanctioning Brazil because of the arbitrary trials in the Supreme Court, the hunt for the political prisoners from January 8th. Those protesters thrown into dungeons for daring to question ballot boxes that look more like black boxes from a crashed airplane, and a level of censorship that makes China seem like an open forum. Trump, in recent statements during his campaign and his bid to return to power, was crystal clear. In a letter sent in July 2025, he threatened 50% tariffs against Brazil to rectify the serious injustices of the current regime, citing secret and illegal censorship and the treatment of Jair Bolsonaro as a witch hunt. He reiterated that Brazil is turning into a disguised dictatorship, with judges censoring social media and imprisoning opponents without evidence. This is not democracy, it's communism, and they will not fund regimes that trample on freedom. Friends of Decoder Talks, stop everything and pay attention. This deserves a loud curse word, one that echoes through the guts of Brazilian hypocrisy. Picture the scene. Tarcísio de Freitas, the governor of Sao Paulo, has the shameless audacity to barge into the American embassy in Brasilia just to suck up to a mere U.S. charged affair. Yes, just some random envoy, because Donald Trump, the president who doesn't put up with banana republics, didn't even bother to send a real consul to deal with Brazil. This diplomatic dwarf led by an almost senile president who turns the country into an international joke. If I were Trump, I'd tell them to shove this diplomatic jibudicabo where the sun doesn't shine. But let's get to the point, no beating around the bush. Tarcísio not only upset Jair Bolsonaro, his former ally, but also Eduardo Bolsonaro and Paulo Figueiredo, the tireless voices who coordinated these sanctions directly with the White House staff, and for more than justifiable reasons. These uncalled hypocrites, like Tarcísio, pretend that the tariffs imposed by Trump in July 2025, which dragged Brazil into the center of a punitive trade war, are just the result of the American president waking up on the wrong side of the bed. Nothing could be more false and manipulative. Tarcísio lived through all these issues alongside Bolsonaro, knows exactly what it's about, and now acts like an innocent saint. He doesn't need to chase after foreigners begging for scraps, and he knows that better than anyone. He does it because he's a hypocrite and a scoundrel. The tariffs will disappear the moment tyranny in Brazil backs down. It's simple, assertive, and non-negotiable. Free the more than 1,500 people who have been charged, and many already convicted, thousands of political prisoners from January 8th, including lawmakers and ordinary citizens thrown into dungeons for daring to question the establishment. Suspend the draconian censorship that silences dissenting voices and turns the Supreme Court into a court of exception, as the BBC described it. Do you want to avoid the fate of Cuba and Venezuela, isolated and starving under eternal sanctions? Free Brazil from this plague of dictatorship disguised as democracy. This is the real issue, not this diplomatic farce that these scoundrels in robes and their allies stage to fool public opinion, made up of 3 sleepy Globo trash viewers who still swallow ready-made narratives. Enough with the circus, enough with the hypocrisy. Tarcísio and his crew are embarrassing Brazil with this cheap act, while the country is bleeding economically. Wake up. Demand freedom. Well, cross-referencing with official reports, the U.S. State Department, and documents from 2025, highlights concerns about political polarization in Brazil and threats to democratic institutions. Although Freedom House still classifies the country as a democracy with vibrant debate, it notes a deterioration in freedom indicators. Source: freedomhouse.org. Reports like the one from VDM point to 25 years of global autocratization, with Brazil showing signs of effective polarization and democratic erosion through informational pollution. They list Brazil alongside nations experiencing democratic erosion, explicitly citing court decisions against platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and the exile of journalists such as Alan dos Santos and Paulo Figueiredo. And what does the Brazilian media do? They cover it up. It's just economic protectionism, shout the Folha columnists, while UOL publishes articles about the WTO as a solution, as if appealing to the World Trade Organization would solve what is, at its core, an ideological dispute. But let's mix things up, because it's not just Trump running his mouth, it's a global strategy. The U.S., under internal pressure from conservatives and economic liberals, has been using tariffs as a hybrid weapon since the Trump 1.0 era. Against China for intellectual property theft and human rights, against Russia over Ukraine, and now against Brazil for democratic backsliding and the way Bolsonaro is being treated. In 2025, with the global economy in a mild recession and world GDP growing only 2%, according to the IMF, Washington doesn't hesitate to link trade to values. If you censor, imprison dissidents, and rig elections, you don't sell to us. Paulo Figueiredo, in recent live streams, connected this with data from the Heritage Foundation. Brazil rose slightly in the 2025 Economic Freedom Index to 55.1 points, ranking 117, but it still reflects accumulated declines since 2023 due to censorship that drives away tech investments. Just look at Elon Musk calling Moraes a dictator and threatening to leave the country. Eduardo Bolsonaro, in testimonies before the U.S. Congress in June, warned that sanctions are just the beginning. There's more to come, like the freezing of assets and visa bans for Brazilian authorities. And what about the mainstream media? Silence or deflection? CNN Brazil talks about a trade war as if it were a spat between neighbors over a wall, ignoring the fact that the wall is actually crushed freedom of expression. The process of sinking, stages of economic and social consequences. Now, the process of sinking, because standing up to the U.S. with talk of sovereignty is like a mosquito challenging an elephant to a slap fight. Let's break it down into stages for clarity. First stage, immediate impacts of the tariffs. The initial tariffs, like the 50% ones on Brazilian steel and aluminum announced in June 2025, along with general threats in July, are going to be costly. Estimates from the Ministry of the Economy, manipulated, of course, admit to losses of billions in exports just in 2025. But independent analysts, like those from FISP, project up to $3 billion, with mass layoffs at steel mills in Minas and Espírito Santo. Inflation rises, steel is the foundation for construction and industry, unemployment explodes, already at 8% officially, and the dollar shoots up to 6 reais, making imports like medicine and fuel more expensive. The media covers it up. Reciprocity, let's tax American products, shout Globo's anchors, but reciprocity is suicide. The U.S. buys 10 times more from Brazil than it sells. So retaliating is like shooting yourself in the foot with a bazooka. Second stage, parallel sanctions and an economic avalanche. Parallel sanctions hit like an avalanche. Trump, at a rally in Miami last month, promised, "We will freeze the assets of corrupt Brazilians and block visas for judges who censor." Looking at history, take the American Magnitsky Act, already used against Russians and Chinese for human rights issues. Now they're targeting Moraes and company, blocking accounts in the U.S. and banning travel. American companies, Google, Meta, are ramping up boycotts, just like X did when it defied censorship orders. Economically, FDI, foreign direct investment, plummets from $50 billion in 2024 to projections of $20 billion in 2026, according to the World Bank. Meanwhile, communism is advancing, with more nationalizations disguised as regulation, like the media bill that Barroso supports. Socially, regular people are suffering. Hunger is back, 30 million facing food insecurity according to the IBGE. Protests are growing, but they're being suppressed as coup-mongering disinformation. Decoder talks, friends. Here's another aside that's going to blow your minds, and for good reason. You can call Trump all sorts of names, but one thing's undeniable. The guy is a badass strategist, the kind who plays Monopoly on master level, buying up properties and bankrupting his opponents without mercy. In the case of that scoundrel Alexander de Moraes, Trump is setting up a double checkmate. First, by applying the Magnitsky Act to freeze assets and block visas, isolating the judge as an international pariah. Second, by pushing legal actions through Trump Media and Rambol, which could lead to him being considered a global fugitive if convicted of rights violations. That's right. If the gavel comes down, Moraes becomes wanted, hunted around the world. And this isn't speculation. It's American retaliation taking shape. A joy for every Brazilian who values freedom and justice. Third stage, collapse, Venezuela style. $100, 80% of Brazil's reserves and treasuries. The government prints money. Hyperinflation explodes, like in recent Argentina, at 100% per year. The rich flee. Look at Brazilian billionaires buying Portuguese citizenships en masse, according to the Lisbon consulate. The middle class becomes poor, the poor become destitute, and the regime survives through repression. More censorship. We already have the internet civil framework twisted to silence opponents. Political imprisonments. 800 from January 8 still rotting, according to Amnesty International. And narratives about Yankee imperialism. Cuba and Venezuela are the model. Sovereignty on their lips, hunger in their bellies. Lula and his crew know. Standing up to the U.S. is signing up for isolation, but communism loves that. A dependent people is a controlled people. Friends of Decoder Talks, let's get straight to the point without beating around the bush. The Brazilian people, yes, you who work hard day after day, will keep footing the bill for the extravagances of the executive and his not-so-executive crew, like the First Lady and entourages on five-star trips with champagne, gourmet dinners, and luxury hotels. In 2025, spending on these diplomatic sprees has already surpassed $100 million just on per diems and airfare, including trips through Europe and Asia, where the focus seems to be more on tourism than on business. All of it funded by the sweat of the average taxpayer. And if the excuse is to attract investment to Brazil, they're already off to a bad start because huge entourages show a disregard for public funds. And obviously this demonstrates to investors the lack of seriousness of this banana republic. In other words, luxurious trips that get splashed across the media and tabloids actually have the opposite effect. Discouraging investors who are looking for seriousness isn't stupid. They're not going to fall for the sweet talk of someone who can barely read. Of course, the congressional and judicial oligarchy, who turn modest salaries of up to 40,000 reais a month, plus extra allowances, into empires of giant farms, cattle herds, stock market investments, and palatial real estate, will feel a loss in profits with the American sanctions. Reports from the Federal Court of Accounts, TCU, from June 2025 revealed that lawmakers and judges have declared billion-dollar assets in agribusiness and real estate. But now, with the dollar soaring and exports slowing down, that's starting to bother them. And guess what? They're going to adjust taxes to make up for it, putting even more of the burden on regular folks. Enough with the hypocrisy. While the communist elephant dances, it's the people who pay for the orchestra. Wake up and demand change. Decoder Talks exposing the raw truth. Mainstream media, temple merchants, and state propaganda. And what about the mainstream media? Those temple merchants. UOL, Globo, CNN. Pure propaganda, funded by billions in public money. $5 billion just in 2024, according to the TCU. They sell sovereignty as an elixir, but it's actually poison. They ignore the fact that Trump, in a statement to Reuters in June, linked tariffs to censorship and political prisoners in Brazil, just like in China. APnews.com. Instead of investigating, they deflect. The MC will fix it. They scheme, they shout, while the country bleeds. Turn off that garbage, my friends. Switch to independent sources, lives on X, podcasts like mine, because watching 2 minutes of big media is like drinking dirty water. You think it quenches your thirst, but all you get is ideological dysentery. Conclusion: wake up before the collapse. In the end, the communist elephant laughs. Sovereignty is a pretty word for a starving dictatorship. Wake up before you become Venezuela, because over there, progress means standing in line for rationed bread. Decoder Talks, deciphering the unspeakable. Take care.